series, I guess, on the Sicilian Najdorf, the Sozin variation. Um, and I'm also going to use it as an opportunity to make fun of my brother because he played a terrible game against me using this line. And I have a good friendship with my brother, but I think it'll drive him crazy a little bit to make fun of him on YouTube. So I'm compelled to do it. All right, so here we are in the open Sicilian. My brother played the Najdorf variation, a6. I guess he had the first 6 moves memorized. I chose bishop to c4, which is the Sozin variation. He blunted the diagonal of the bishop with e6. White is best dropping his bishop back to b3 because b5 is going to come, so he might as well not have time on the bishop. And now here, white has some options. He could play bishop to g5, castle and queen side. I chose castle king side. He brought his knight out to d7, rook to e1, and he brought his knight to c5, which is an inaccurate move in this position, actually. I think he knew from a theoretical perspective that if you have the bishop pair, you have an advantage, but he didn't contend with this response, which is bishop to d5. Which I think is a very strong response, and it's very surprising. It's one of those eye-popping moves that you see in the Sozin variation, which is why the Sozin is so fun to play a lot of times. Black has some options. He could take with the knight. He could put his bishop on b7, and I think I'll cover those in a different video. What he did is he took the bishop immediately. I think maybe he thought I made a mistake or something. It is the move that I would play, even though it opens the e-file and it puts you in check. You would have to know that king to d7 is the correct move in this position. So it's not what my brother played. He played bishop to e7. And so the subject of this video is all the ways in which this will go wrong. The strong response here is knight to c6, attacking the queen, winning the bishop. So what my brother did is he moved his queen out of the way. I don't think he wanted to trade his queen for the knight and the rook. So he moved it all the way to b6 instead of c7 or d7. Here, you take the bishop. King only has one move, f8. So that's forcing. And now white could play bishop to f4, which is strong. But I think the best move here is queen to d4 because there's a threat to take the knight on f6. So my brother, didn't see that threat. And so, his position fell apart immediately. He moved knight to a4, which just looks like a bad move. I guess he wanted to trade the queen, but then the threat here, you take the knight with your queen, threat and checkmate on f7. He took my queen back. What choice did he have? My bishop came to h6, putting him in check. King has one square. Rook to e8, checkmate. So if instead he had played bishop to b7, with the idea of using his rook to block the e8 square, the threat is still the same because you take, and when he takes back, you put him in check, and now the rook actually moves down to e3 with a threat that, the knight would come here to e7 with a checkmate, or the rook would go over to g3 with a checkmate. You can only stop one of those threats, and then rook g3 checkmate. So that's another line that's worth memorizing. Okay, so what are better moves in this position? I would say that knight back to d7 is more logical because the knight defends the knight here on f6. But here, white can slide his queen over to f4. And when the queen drops back to defend the pawn, the other knight can come in on e4 to attack that pawn. And if the knight takes, that's checkmate, so the knight can't take. If instead, the bishop comes out to attack the knight here on c6, then you could just take the pawn with your knight, and then there's a threat here on f7. So the king would sidestep, you take the pawn, and now this knight here could come into to e7 with an attack. So the king might need to get a square to run to, so when the knight comes in, the king can sidestep to h7, but queen takes h6 is actually checkmate because this pawn is pinned and the queen is defended with the bishop. So that's losing also. There's so many threats in this position, which is, perhaps why, you just cannot play bishop to e7. All right, so let's see what else. If the knight takes the pawn, so that when you take back, the bishop could come in the way on e6. You could take the pawn with your queen. You could also take the bishop with your rook, so that, let's say, if he takes back with a knight, you could take the pawn on d6, check. King can't go here because that's checkmate, so the king goes in the corner. Knight over to e7 is a check. It also wins the queen, but you could also put him in double check. This would be checkmate here, or if the king moves back, you could move your queen over here, check, and then if he takes with the rook or the knight, it's all the same. The knight comes to e7, that's checkmate. So, that's another really pretty one. So, that move I don't think works. Okay, so what else? I think Black's best try maybe in this position is to move his knight back to g8. And now a move that's really interesting is you could just throw away your rook. So when he takes you take the pawn, getting that rook again. If he moves his bishop here to f5, which is supposed to be the good move in this position, you can take the rook right away, or you could move your bishop to h6 with a threat on the square. If the knight were to take, you could just take back and then take, or also strong is to move your rook over to e1. This position is going to fall apart for Black very fast. So maybe Black would be better moving his bishop back in this position to g6, and when you put him in check, you then take the rook. Maybe he would take your bishop and give up his rook just to kind of free its position a little bit. Yeah, there are a lot of ways in which this position will go south for Black very fast. If he like attacked the knight and wasted time, you can move your rook over with a threat here. So if you took his knight, for example, you just walk your queen over. So that's another way in which this position can go badly for Black. So that's what happens when you get your queen stuck in the corner here. So what else could happen here? If instead the queen goes to c7 or d7, let's choose c7, and you end up trading the queen for the rook and the knight, White still has a good game. You can put queen on e2, and if the king runs away, then bishop to f4 attacks the pawn. If this knight jumps here to e8 to defend the pawn, rook to e1 is a strong reply. If maybe better is knight to b7 to defend this pawn, but then rook to e1 is still strong. If he tries to develop the bishop, you throw your bishop away for the pawn, but you win back the knight. That's an option in this position. So you can see that, so sometimes it's okay to have minor pieces instead of a queen. However, the pieces would have to be coordinated well, and your king would have to be safe, and that's not what is happening in this position. So that's another way in which I feel I could have beaten my brother if he had played those lines instead. All right, cool. Thanks for tuning in. Next video, I will show you what would happen if instead the king goes to d7, which is a much more theoretical position, which is a little bit more equal. The knight to c6 is still a strong reply, and then if the queen comes to b6, which is the strongest reply in this position, queen to d4 would not be so strong, because if the knight comes to a4 trying to trade off, queen to f4 is no longer a threat because the king and the bishop are both defending this pawn. So the features of the position are a little bit different here. I would recommend instead playing bishop to g5. Or you could also kick the knight, and then when these pieces get exchanged, you start advancing your pawns. And that's going to be very hard to stop. If Black ever wants to get rid of your knight, he's going to end up probably having to deal with a passed pawn. So I'll go into those lines in more detail, but they deserve their own video. All right, bye.